Welcome back. We're going to wrap up the first section of the module here, the historical overview today, which is why I want to start on time. We had briefly touched on the philosophy of mind, which went back to the 17th century and René Descartes. And then we had begun the last day to look at the much younger history of scientific psychology. Beginning, of course, with the observation that psychology is many things. Scientific psychology is only one part of that, and psychology arises for other reasons. We need stories to tell about ourselves. We need to take care of each other. Soteriology is the business of caring and trying to find out what's good for us. So psychology has all of this. It's got the self-help tradition. And there wasn't room for a scientific psychology until the middle of the 19th century. We needed Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution to place humans in the natural realm, place us among the animals, make it clear that we are continuous with other animals. And this removed a lot of the fanciful input from theology and from religion. So in the middle of the 19th century then, people began to ask, how could we do a science of ourselves, as it were? And we looked at the origins of experimental psychology with Wilhelm Wundt, and over in Germany and over in America we had William James, who gave us the stream of consciousness notion, originated the self-help tradition in psychology, and wrote the first textbook, The Principles of Psychology. And remember, at this time, science was gathering steam. Science is not that old. It's only about 500, modern science is about 500 years old. And in the 19th century, it was beginning to pay off huge dividends. It was greatly transforming people's lives, transforming how they lived and worked, what they consumed, the makeup of society. And amongst all this, then people started to ask, how could we turn this scientific method to better understand ourselves? A question we will never have a definitive answer to, of course. And we saw that they initially did everything they could. There was all kinds of behavioral and experimental investigation. We mentioned hypnosis or mesmerism. We mentioned armchair theorizing and philosophizing as usual. And we mentioned the peculiar discipline of psychophysics, which emerged around the 1870s and is the one really unbroken tradition of scientific psychology that persists today. And we had an example of that where we looked at things we can measure. Our example was from sound, where we can measure the frequency of a sound, that is, how fast the air vibrates for a particular sound. And we looked at the counterpart in the perceptual domain, which is pitch, which we hear, for some frequencies we hear low-pitched sounds. Greater frequencies give rise to higher pitched sound. And this mapping from what we can measure to what we experience and can only get at by asking people is the peculiar structure of the domain of psychophysics. It's almost like Cartesian dualism come to life. Nobody's happy with Descartes' metaphysics, but here we have a sort of an experimental angle where we establish regularities between what people report on one hand, those are the perceived properties, and what we can measure with confidence. On the other hand, those are the physical properties. A very strange business and still going on today. But the last of the elements that we had identified as being ways that people began to do psychology merits more attention, and this was introspection. Introspection is the slightly odd business of asking people, what's going on in your mind? How are you reasoning to solve a problem? What are the stages that you take when you make a plan, or when you take a decision, or what's going on? And it turns out that, well, we're never entirely free of introspection, because if someone comes along with a story that is a complete variance with the way that you understand your own life, you'll reject it. But as a scientific method, it has its problems. Now, the attempts made to use introspection in the context of scientific inquiry were not just asking people free-floating questions like, so how did you reach that decision? There were strict protocols put in place, experimental protocols, questionnaire protocols. A lot of rigor was brought to bear on this, but it just didn't work very well. What they found was that if you developed a protocol, ran experiments, and asked people in one laboratory, you got different answers if you went to a different laboratory. In fact, the researcher involved always mattered. So this was not science in a simply objective sense at all. It didn't yield results that were stable and that were reliable. And frankly, a lot of people started being very critical of the use of introspection within any kind of a scientific inquiry. And that gave rise to a backlash to some extent. The backlash happened largely in the Anglo-American realm, although we see Russian components to it today. It gave rise to something called behaviorism, which was an attempt to be more rigorously scientific, really sciencey. And behaviorism took the questionable approach of simply outlawing any reference to shady, unobservable mental states. So that business of asking people what they perceive or how they reach judgments, we're going to get rid of all that. We're going to include in our theories only things we can measure. And this gave rise to a scientific field that had different forms. There were quite a few different schools of behaviorism. And the principal names we'll be concerned with today are Skinner. Who's heard of Skinner? Who's heard of Pavlov? Who's heard of Watson? Okay, they're the three probably most famous people. We'll be dealing today with Skinner and Pavlov. Watson arises in the context of the readings and for this week. But basically what they're doing is they're taking a bunch of questions we might have about, as I said, minds, brains, and behavior, and they're cutting the Gordian knot by saying, yeah, let's make it simpler. Let's just get rid of this guy, because he's a bit of a problem. And there's various ways you can do this. Of course, we're talking about the first half of the 20th century. There weren't very many ways to study brains back then. You could study brains of dead people, you could do anatomical studies, but we didn't have available to us means for recording brain activity with any precision. So most of these studies ended up being behavioral studies, and the concerns of behaviorists were how is behavior acquired? How do new behaviors arise? And how is behavior shaped or modified through experience? With that, we are conducting an inquiry that's very empirical. And we've mentioned before that the pendulum that swings from empiricism to rationalism has never stopped in Western philosophy, and it keeps doing it in cognitive science as well. So we're dealing with a strongly empirical approach. We're going to start looking at a particular kind of learning introduced by Skinner called operant conditioning. Conditioning means the acquisition and modification of behavior. And the underlying idea behind operant conditioning couldn't be simpler. The idea is that behavior is modified as a result of its consequences. So if you do something and it leads to a nice outcome for you, you're more likely to do it again. If you burn yourself, you're not going to do that again. So reward and punishment are very basic mechanisms for shaping behavior. Now it gets more detailed than that, but the underlying idea is very simple. And in order to develop experimental programs here, you need to put in place lots of ways of rewarding and punishing behavior. And so most behaviorists worked on animals rather than humans. There were exceptions, but most of the work is done on animals, because you're free to experiment with animals in a way that you're not with humans, obviously. Skinner is most famous for his work on pigeons. He worked on a variety of animals, but he's most famous for his work on pigeons. And we're going to discuss just one particular exemplary study where the pigeons, as usual, were kept isolated. They were kept in what were called Skinner boxes. That's a Skinner box illustrated there. It's a solitary confinement for pigeons. Now, already you should have questions. If I take a bird that normally lives in a social environment with other birds and other animals and has available to it a range of natural resources, a whole ecology, and I take that bird and I stick it into a box and I study it in the box, am I studying the bird or am I studying the bird in a box? So this isolation really, really matters. There were some other things that really matter in the experiment. We're going to look at the birds were kept at about 2/3 of their normal weight, which means they're starving. They're ravenous birds. And food is going to be extremely important to them. And in the case we're going to look at, there was a regime put in place whereby food was delivered to the birds on a random schedule. So they cannot predict when food is going to arrive. Given those conditions, isolation, motivation by being extremely hungry, and random delivery of food, there was a weird behavioral result. Birds developed stereotypical behaviors. Each bird developed a different one, and it almost looked as if the birds were thinking to themselves. Now, I'm going to give you a very fanciful interpretation of this. This is not a scientific account. Imagine, though, that you're a bird there, and you're starving, and food arrives, and you go, "Wow, that's great. What was I doing that made that happen?" And so you try doing whatever you were doing, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and sooner or later, food arrives, and you go, "Wow, it worked again." You're like a gambler at the roulette table who forgets all the losses and remembers only the wins, right? And so that behavior becomes selectively strengthened. Now that's a fanciful interpretation. That is not, I'm not suggesting that pigeons are little gamblers and that they're thinking in this human way. But the result is described here. These became known as the superstitious pigeons. And you can see the stereotypical behavior. One bird turns counterclockwise around the cage. Another one thrusts its head into the upper corners of the cage. The third one develops a tossing response. Two birds develop pendulum motions of the head and body. There's no rhyme or reason to the individual solutions, but in each case, something has become stereotyped, exaggerated, and reinforced. So you can see what's happened here. The regime, the context, has produced a behavioral change which can be discussed in terms of operant conditioning, discussed in terms of the feeding regime and the reward value for the bird of the food delivery. Now, Skinner's approach here is not typical for all of behaviorism. He developed his own school of behaviorism. And he's quite notable for his sensitivity to the fact that behavior only makes sense in a specific context. That's something that's a really important lesson that we're sort of relearning today. When we go and look at Pavlov, what we'll see is he was less sensitive to context, and it leads to a certain logical error. And there is a danger that if you see a behavior and you start making up theories and attributing it to all kinds of internal factors, you're ignoring the context in which the behavior arises. We have a tendency to do that. We've done it repeatedly. And these days in cognitive science, one of the things that's happening is we're developing a renewed sensitivity for the importance of embedding and context, and downplaying, as it were, in some approaches, the appeal to internal mechanisms. So Skinner's not irrelevant. Now, the methods that Skinner developed turned out to be extremely effective at shaping animal behavior. One thing we learned is that reward is far more efficient than punishment. Punishment doesn't really work, but reward really works. And so behavioral shaping, based on these kinds of basic theories, is widely used for training animals to do stupid tricks in circuses and other purposes too. Now, when we go on and review subsequent developments in the history of cognitive science, it's going to look like behaviorism was overthrown by a new paradigm called computational theory of mind, and it went away and was discarded. That did not happen. Behaviorists are still there, and they're making big fat piles of cash. And they're working on you. You are their lab rats, and they are manipulating your behavior every time you go into Tesco, every time you open up your computer. They are steering and nudging behavior through false information campaigns, through the use of Facebook, through advertising and marketing, and educational programs. We have the business of shaping behavior has not gone away. It's not necessarily so relevant to our theories of individual minds, as we'll see, but behaviorism developed techniques that have never stopped developing, and there's a great deal of suspicion that actually the Russians got much better at this than we did. So to the Russians we now turn. And here's Ivan Pavlov, another fine bearded man. Pavlov's form of behaviorism is also concerned with how our behavior is acquired and modified. Where Skinner had operant conditioning, wherein behavior modified on the basis of reward and punishment, Pavlov has classical conditioning, which uses the language of stimulus and response. You've all heard of stimulus and response, and we're going to point out some very fundamental problems with treating people as if they were responding to stimuli. But let's first understand the very basic architecture of classical conditioning in its most canonical form, which is the experiments done with the dog. Most of you will have heard of these. Now, when a dog is hungry and is presented with food, it will salivate. And we understand that as a sensible sort of reaction that is developed through natural selection. And it's preparing the dog, giving it the right kind of juices for digestion and chewing and so on. It makes sense in the natural history of the dog. Bells, on the other hand, are meaningless for dogs. They're not real Catholic. They don't respond to bells. Bells just they're not sailors. Pavlov developed a regime where he would pair something which was meaningless, the bell, with something which is meaningful, the food. Now, the food produces salivation, but if you pair it repeatedly with the bell, eventually an association is formed such that the bell on its own can induce salivation. So we've gone from the meaning of the unconditioned stimulus, the food, is transferred to the conditioned stimulus, the bell. So something which has its roots in the natural history of the dog now appears to be transferred symbolically to the bell. This was interesting. Pavlov got the Nobel Prize for this. There he is in his lab. I want to point out to you, or I'm going to use a colleague to point out to you where there's a really big hole in this theory. So I hope the sound works sufficiently. This is Heinz von Förster on the right, early cybernetician, talking with Umberto Maturana, and they're talking in the 1960s or 70s, long after this. And Heinz von Förster is going to recount a replication of Pavlov's work with one change.
Fascinating experiments to establish the intelligence of animals. I think the most beautiful thing is the Pavlov studies to getting the conditioned reflexing going. Yeah? He had a dog, putting a dog on a table, and there was an assistant in a white coat. The assistant showed the dog a piece of meat, and when the dog looked at it, of course, he was looking forward, he salivated, a lot of saliva was coming up, and then the assistant rang a bell. Okay, very good. They do this 10 times, and then the assistant enters the room, rings the bell, and the dog salivates. This was for dog, the proof for conditional reflex. The dog can transfer the ringing of the bell to the meat without being even shown the meat. An act of symbolization. Mm-hmm. And of course, he got for that the Nobel Prize. A Polish experimental psychologist said Pavlov wrote his experimental conditions so well in his lab books that I can repeat his experiments exactly as he carried it out. So Konowski did exactly the experiment, the lab assistant with the same white coat, the dog at the table next to the window, a bell standing next to the table, assistant going with the meat, with the bell, meat and bell. And now comes the experimentum crucis, where no meat is shown, but only the bell is around. Konowski took the clapper out of the bell without the assistant knowing that. So assistant goes in, grabs the bell, no sound is coming out, but the dog salivates. So Konowski concluded the ringing of the bell was a stimulus for Pavlov, not for the dog.
Not for the dog.
But unfortunately, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for that.
No.
He just put his finger on a real problem here. So Konowski replicated Pavlov's experiment absolutely faithfully with one exception. At the crucial moment, the bell made no sound and the dog still salivated. Von Förster says the bell was a stimulus for Pavlov and not for the dog. Pavlov had decided the sound of the bell was most important. The dog was not in on this decision. We've just been imagining ourselves to be pigeons. Now let's imagine ourselves to be the dog in this experiment. Every day the assistant comes in and carries you out and plonks you down on the table, and there's the windows, and here comes all these things. You know perfectly well what's coming. The bell, the sound of the bell is a detail. It's part of the overall flow of everything. The dog is embedded in its entire world. And it was Pavlov who decided it was the sound of the bell that was the stimulus. So anytime we see talk of stimulus and response, beware! This logical problem arises greatly. But behaviorism had its problems. It provided a sort of a mechanistic view of the human spirit, and it denied a lot of the richness of our lived qualitative lives that we all have. It gave us a theory of learning, but it was an impoverished theory of learning, very mechanical, and it had completely abandoned one of the twin goals of psychology. As you remember, the birth of psychology there was two big sort of goals. One was to account for human behavior. Why do we do what we do? How do we learn to do what we do? How do we modify those behaviors? But the other was, how does our experience arise? How do we perceive the world? How do we feel things? How do we address the qualitative nature of lived experience? And behaviorism had thrown that out completely. Things came to a head. There was a large revolution that happened in the middle of the 20th century, which gave rise to what we're going to call the cognitivist revolution. Well, one particular episode here is quite infamous. Skinner had turned his attention away from rats and pigeons and so on, and he turned to humans, and he'd written a book on human language, or as he called it, verbal behavior, which is a funny way to describe language. Skinner was, of course, an empiricist. He wanted behavior to be induced by your experience with the world. So speaking English meant acquiring a bunch of habits through prior contact with English speakers. So you develop these habits that allow you to respond appropriately during an English conversation. Now, a young upstart academic called Noam Chomsky at MIT, who had just written a PhD on the structure of sentences, wrote a critique of this book that blew it out of the water. The critique is far more famous than the book. He made the obvious point that such theories can never account for how children learn language. And they miss something fundamental about language, which is that language is not the mere application of habit. Most sentences that have been spoken in the world are actually kind of unique. Just as this sentence is unique, and I'm going to make sure this sentence is unique by sticking the word giraffe nonsensically in there. Now we have a sentence that has never been spoken before in the history of the world. So I couldn't have acquired it as a habit, right? And in the last lecture I used porridge, and the next lecture I'll use some other word. So it's always possible to come up with new sentences. That's not a problem. So language appears here for the first time as a central battlefield for theories of mind, and that's not an accident. After the 1950s, 1960s, well, around that turn, we see a complete shift in the language people use when talking about minds and behavior. What has happened is that throughout the Second World War and the early 1950s, a whole bunch of innovations have given rise to the language of what we now take for granted, of computers, computing, hardware, software, and information. And all this is giving rise to a new way of thinking about minds called the computational theory of mind. Theories of language played an important role here, and they were not so important prior to this. And since then, language has been very central to our philosophies of mind, and it's interesting to ask why. Chomsky was very, very influential here, and he represents a strongly rationalist counterpart to the empirical approaches of behaviorism. Chomsky points out that kids learn language really, really quickly, despite the fact that the language they're exposed to is a bit dodgy, doesn't include lots of carefully constructed examples and counter-examples. In fact, people talk weird to kids. Did you ever hear anyone talking to him? But look at him, he's got his granny's nose. Out of that, somehow they learn language. And furthermore, they do it at age 2, and now you're much cleverer and wiser than any kid, but god damn, it's hard to learn a language at your age, right? So there's something going on at that age that facilitates the learning of language. So Chomsky identifies a strongly rationalist idea that there's something in the biology here. Kids are born ready to be language users, born with something which he called a universal grammar. We'll come back to this later on in the module. The universal grammar dictates the space of possible languages, so the child is not learning from scratch. The child, when learning a language, is merely setting a few switches so that it learns the particular language of its environment, but it's born ready to learn language. Now this becomes part of a much bigger story. And it's not just the linguists who are involved. In fact, Noam Chomsky, misspelled there, the linguist worked very closely together with another guy, Jerry Fodor here, who's a philosopher of mind. And between them, they contributed greatly to the emergence of this new idea of the computational theory of mind. Fodor made use of Chomsky's ideas about language, which we're going to explore more in this module. But let's just say a little bit about what Fodor contributed. First of all, we have a new language available to us, the language of computers, of information, of software and hardware. Now, if you think of the way that your computer is organized, first of all, you've got a bunch of functions written in a general purpose programming language, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a Macintosh or a Windows computer. What matters is the organization of information within the program. Furthermore, you've got a bunch of separate programs that do separate things. You might call them apps now. Any one of them, like a word processing program, is built up out of modules, smaller components that do specific things, that serve specific functions. Fodor took this vocabulary and thought about minds in this way, suggesting that evolution might have equipped us with, as it were, separate modules that solve separate problems. So language is obviously a very big task, but the stuff that evolved for language will be separate from the stuff that evolved for hammering or for solving problems or for doing all kinds of things. The idea here is that one can conceive of mind as being made up of separate units or modules, each of which only makes use of the information that it needs. So here's that language of information coming in. He says they're informationally encapsulated, and they solve specific problems, so they're domain specific. The idea is that evolution had shaped us in this way. And the metaphor that's being employed here is strongly the metaphor of programs, software running on a computer, computation. So this is a modern version of a really old idea, which is that the mind has various faculties. We met it, or we will meet it in a really discredited branch of science called phrenology. The old idea that our internal makeup can be carved up into distinct competences or faculties. He made another significant contribution. So this is one book, The Modularity of Mind. His next book was The Language of Thought, which leaned more heavily on the theories of linguistic theories that were emerging from the likes of Chomsky. Fodor turned his attention to thought. Now let's start with the observation that thinking is not a well-defined word, no more than mind. Nobody has ever come up with a definition of thinking that will make everyone happy. It's one of those words that we use in an everyday sense without any problem. It's difficult to discipline it if we want to turn it into part of a scientific account. We have to give it specific meanings to the exclusion of other uses that word serves. Fodor started recognizing that some of what goes by the name of thinking is language-like. We conduct interior dialogues. We sort of speak to ourselves in our inner voice. And furthermore, complicated thoughts, like I would like a pie, have structure in their own right, a bit like the sentence, I would like a pie, has structure. So there's a movement from a subject, I, towards a distal object, pie. There's what we might call predication. I am expressing something with respect to the pie in both the thought and the sentence. Now, he's not claiming that everything that you want to claim is thinking is of this nature, but he's noting a strong affinity between the emerging view of language from Chomsky's theory, all about structure and symbols, and some aspects of our interior lives. So the language of thought became part of this big emerging picture. So now we've got a huge revolution, middle 20th century. We've got the metaphor of the computer, we've got the software-hardware division, we've got programs. We've got the notion of information. And I need to say just something about information. We use that word all the time. We use it as if we knew what it meant. There was a very important mathematical theory developed in the 1940s by Claude Shannon of information that gave us the language of bits and bytes. It was a theory of communication for passing encoded messages. It was not a general purpose theory of nature. And the word information is often misconstrued and taken out of its constrained use in that theory, as if the world now was simply full of chairs, tables, light, air, and information. Information is not a natural substance lying around. So we have to be careful. The word information has been used and abused in many, many ways. But out of this new technical language emerges the computational theory of mind, which gives rise to both a new kind of scientific psychology, which we call cognitive psychology, and to the dream of artificial intelligence, a dream which is rooted in that time of the 50s and 60s. So we're going to look at both of those now, briefly. And the first thing to note with artificial intelligence is that the way that word works today is not the way it worked in the 1960s. The term has evolved and changed. Back in the 1960s, we've got a new theory of mind, the computational theory of mind, and it was natural to wonder whether you could make an artificial program that responded, in some respects, like a human. There was a very, very brave hypothesis put forward in 1963, the physical symbol system hypothesis, which said that a physical symbol system, that means basically a computer, something which can take symbols and rearrange them according to rules, has the necessary and sufficient means of general intelligent action. This makes use of a weird notion of intelligence, which was popular in the 50s and 60s, doesn't really exist anymore, or shouldn't really exist anymore, that we could be characterized as a form of intelligence, which sort of separated humans from animals. This is the soul is not dead here. But minds have been excited now by these new metaphors and the power of computation. Symbols in a computer program that are manipulated according to rules are a lot like words, which Chomsky was showing can be manipulated according to rules. And when you manipulate them according to rules, rearrange symbols, different meanings emerge. This is true of computer programs, and it's true to some respect of some aspects of natural language. And so we get this idea, strongly rationalist, intellectualist, abstract notion of minds as sort of general problem-solving devices. Here's a kind of a puzzle that is typical of the kind of puzzles that computers could solve and humans could solve. Imagine, if you will, three invisible poles here, and the task is to move that stack of blocks from the leftmost pole to the rightmost pole, never putting a larger block on a smaller block. It's a little puzzle. I had one myself when I was a kid. You solve it in 5 minutes, great fun, go do something else. But because you can write computer programs that seem to solve this kind of thing, this became the kind of example that was very influential in the early days of artificial intelligence. Here's another example we're not going to take through in detail, but this is a dialogue between a person and the computer, interacting using natural language. The person, the computer operator, is typing text, and the computer is responding with text. So the person types, pick up a big red block, referring to a toy world over here. Think of it like a really simple video game world full of blocks. And the person is issuing instructions using natural language, and the computer is responding using natural language. There's a whole bunch of insights that have come together here, linking language and reasoning and computers. And in the 1970s, this was mind-blowing. These days, it's a real yawner. And among the resources for this part of the course, you're asked to read something and have a look at one of these dialogues to ask yourself, how did it appear then and how does it appear now? So certain things that you could get computers to do were just inflaming the imagination of scientists. This old notion of artificial intelligence has died a death. It shouldn't be around anymore. It's not our state of the art when we come to think about minds. It represents, as it were, sort of an inflammation of the intellect from the people working back at the time. This was really, really exciting. Notice that artificial intelligence of that early kind, and an awful lot of cognitive science, especially cognitive psychology, focuses on our ability to reason. That was just an example of reasoning. That's been a rationalist concern since René Descartes, since the 17th century. And we've met it, and we'll meet it again and again. And we'll meet its empirical counterpart, the role of experience, again and again. So when we delve into something strongly abstract, like the computational theory of mind, one question to ask yourself is reasoning really central to your existence? Would you characterize yourself and your existence first and foremost as are you a reasoner? And is that the most important thing about you? Later on, we'll have a class on reasoning, and we'll find out we're not really good at it, but maybe we are. It's complicated. So that's the early days of artificial intelligence, which have changed greatly. But they also gave rise to cognitive psychology, which was closely allied with artificial intelligence back then, shared a lot of concepts. They've parted ways since. Cognitive psychology was another kind of scientific psychology that used the scientific method without recourse to introspection, which had got a bad name. It worked on the basis that you could describe mental lives using the notion of mental states. Now, this is a bit problematic if you take things like beliefs, desires, and intentions, which are all perfectly fine words, but you start treating them as entities in a scientific theory, you're on thin ice. But that provided a way to model human behavior, human capacities for reasoning and thinking. And most work in cognitive psychology has treated humans as information processors of some kind. So this language, this turn in the middle of the 20th century to computation, computer metaphors, hardware, software, and information processing is informing a whole new worldview. And you've met this, you're familiar with this. On this view, brains are more or less hardware, thoughts are more or less software, the senses provide inputs, and behavior is the output. This is the basic architecture of the computational theory of mind. Now, perhaps the most important thing I have to say in this module is that this is frequently represented as if it were the scientific consensus of who we are and how we work. It's not. There is no single orthodoxy. This view coexists with many alternatives. It adopts many problematic assumptions, but it turns out to be a very useful way of asking specific kinds of questions. So one of the purposes of this module is to help you to understand how this view fits alongside other views. What are the advantages and the shortcomings of each? There's been a lot of development since the birth of cognitive psychology. That old-fashioned artificial intelligence approach that thought we could build general-purpose problem-solving machines that reasoned like humans didn't work. It didn't scale up. Those toy worlds remained toy worlds. There has been enormous development and achievement in the field that we now call artificial intelligence, but it has lost all contact with the theory of mind and with human reasoning. The massive progress that has been made has come about through two developments. One is machine learning, which is ways of training general purpose models through exposure to data. And the other is the availability of enormous data sets. Data sets provided by the likes of Google. These have solved problems like speech recognition and speech synthesis and reasoning and planning and telling you how to get from A to B and all those hard problems using no theory, basically, no cognitive science theory, using just brute force learning algorithms and huge data sets. So there's been an enormous amount of progress, but it has not been informative for cognitive science. Secondly, that language of computers has worn a bit thin. I mean, we love our computers, and there's an awful lot to learn about them, and there's lots to say about information processing and the way it affects our lives, but it's not clear that we are well described in this fashion. And other technical languages are now available and widely used. In particular, if you're doing maths or physics or chemistry, you'll use differential equations to describe things, which express deterministic regularities. That use of dynamical systems, which is the mathematical language, is now increasingly used in cognitive science to model all kinds of things at all kinds of levels, from brain level to behavioral levels to interpersonal interactions. All kinds of things can be described using different vocabularies. So we have available to us multiple technical vocabularies. Wind the clock back to 1960 and there's just one game in town, which is computation and computer programs. Another major area of change has been in our ability to actually look at brains. Neuroimaging is something we will touch on later on in this module as well. And our ability to peer into brains has enormously increased. It turns out brains are really hard to understand, which shouldn't be a big surprise. Neuroscience, of course, investigates brains, not minds. There is a different enterprise called cognitive neuroscience, which interprets brains in terms of one theory of mind or another theory of mind. But there are lots of theories of mind. And then we've met this business of, in the philosophy of mind, we started with Descartes and his rationalist flee from the senses, and then we met the empiricists with their emphasis on the senses and learning from experience. We've met this now again, the behaviorists were strongly empirical, and here we've got the computational theory of mind taking a strongly abstract view, a rationalist view, taking out a big loan on innateness and biology, and there's been a swing back. There's been a lot of parallel developments in what we might loosely call embodied cognitive science. Comes in many flavors, but this is just that pendulum swinging back and emphasizing that, hang on, you're talking about minds as if they were disconnected from whole bodies. You're talking about the brain as if it was something magic and was not an organ of the body. The body is extremely important, and we are embedded in the world through our body. So embodied cognitive science emerges as a bunch of approaches, doesn't unify to a single approach, which stands in opposition to this notion that it's all in your head and that you should be conceived of as a rational, thinking, abstract, highly intellectualized, abstract agent. So throughout this course, one of the dichotomies we'll meet again and again will distinguish these two. Over on the left-hand side, we're going to have the computational theory of mind. In the popular press, that's widely regarded as the scientific orthodoxy. That's only because the popular press does a lousy job of reporting on science. It's also because it's very well funded, and it's also because it serves certain political interests. So this business is always both political and scientific at the same time. There's a whole lot of work done in this vein, and we'll be surveying an awful lot of it, and it's great for asking specific kinds of questions. It locates minds in brain activity, puts it inside your head. A central notion, which we'll have to discuss at length, is the notion of representation, which is how does what goes on in your brain, how does it manage to be about the world? And the general image underlying this, I've characterized here as a button push notion of the world. So it places agency inside the body so that your interaction with the world is one of an agent commanding or acting upon an inert material world. So when you go and push a button to get something out of a vending machine, you push a button and you get an effect. It's all unidirectional, from you to the world. Again and again, we're going to meet other stories that ask different questions in which the role of the body and the brain are conceived of completely differently. The brain here is a fully integrated part of the body, as is the kidney or the spleen. So this will de-emphasize this notion of being in your head, will suggest you're not in your head. And the model of interaction with the world here is going to be, I characterize it, the contrast with the button push, the handshake. When two hands shake, it's an interaction. There's action on both sides. And on this view, being in the world is a matter of interacting with the world, not of acting upon the world. More and more, this finds elaboration in a bunch of buzzwords, often beginning with E, so embodied, inactive, extended, and embedded, or sometimes all grouped together under the heading 4E, represents a relatively new development in cognitive science. This is the empiricist pendulum swinging back, and this is not going to stop anytime soon. So here's a very useful graphic developed by Jasper van der Herik, who just did his PhD in this area. And we've met some of these. This illustrates some of the positions that we're going to meet and discuss. So over here, the red stuff is mind. Cartesian substance dualism has mind entirely separate from matter. Right? And they have to interact, and that's a real problem. We just met the behaviorists who cut out the red stuff, cut out the mental stuff completely, reduce the person to a stimulus-response-driven puppet, and provide rich theories of learning that still are very effective in society. The computational theory of mind, as represented in your readings by the Marvin Minsky, Mind is What the Brain Does, covers at least these two versions. On the identity theory, mind is exactly what brain does, and we could switch our vocabularies. We could talk about brains or we could talk about minds. More usually, and the view that we just saw represented by Fodor and Chomsky, in general, of kind of functionalism, is the view that when we talk about minds, we're talking about software, and it could run on brain hardware, it could run on silicon hardware. That's called functionalism. We'll also be talking about embodied cognition here. It's not all in the head. Here, what we want to talk about when it comes to minds, brains, and behavior is a relationship between the body and the world. There are other positions here which won't occupy us so much, but you can see that there's a rich set of options available to us. And the principal goal of this module is to show you that different frameworks allow you to ask different questions. And we should not believe that there is a single scientific approach to the person that has established itself as the orthodox approach. And so I want to wrap up this historical view with a little bit of heresy here. Alchemy is not really considered good science these days. Alchemy was all about looking for the philosopher's stone, turning lead into gold, secret societies, reading hieroglyphs, looking for the secret of eternal life. Isaac Newton, who was no mean scientist, was himself an alchemist, so alchemy has a long tradition. And out of all this activity came some things that we do regard as science. So all the various possibly misplaced goals but frenetic activity of the alchemists and their different questions that they asked gave rise to what we now would call chemistry, gave rise to what we now would call material science, gave rise to a whole bunch of stuff that we would happily accept as mature sciences. Cognitive science is a bit more like alchemy in that it's asking an undisciplined variety of questions. There's lots and lots of questions we can ask, and we don't really expect it to resolve to a single unified framework. But it does spin off frameworks that are good for asking specific questions on specific topics. So alchemy is not a bad model when you come to think of how we might think about cognitive science today. Right, that ends our historical tour. We picked a story up on Thursday where we're going to begin the next topic, and it's going to be language, because language has played such a huge role. Okay, we'll see you on Thursday.